All right, if I were to ask you, where do most people get their moral orientation from?
Parents,
Schools.
Maybe so, yeah. How about in a more general sense?
friends, the media.
Okay, these are all sources, of course, but those parents and friends and media and so forth have to get their orientation somewhere as well.
Religion.
Right. Religion. Okay, traditionally speaking, the many world religions have been the origin of ethics for people. And traditionally, there are two ways of interpreting how religion can serve as the basis for a moral theory. We're going to focus on the work of St. Thomas Aquinas, whose ethical theory is called natural law theory, or natural law ethics. However, I do want to take a moment to inform you of the other tradition in ethics that finds its ground in a religious manner. And that is called divine command theory. Okay? Now, what do you suppose divine command theory says? What would make an action right? Just look at the name. If it is consistent with the commands of a deity. Okay? Good means consistent with whatever God commands. Now, of course, one major difficulty with divine command theory is that it presupposes belief in the existence of God. I cannot say that what is good is what God commands and is binding necessarily and universally if I cannot justify the claim that first, God exists, and secondly, that this set of commands is legitimate. Okay? And there is traditionally another stumbling block for divine command theory, besides the obvious enormous problem of proving the existence of God. And that is the following. If I say that what is right is whatever God commands, this can be interpreted in two different ways. Okay? Do I mean that an action is right simply because God commands it? In other words, it is the command itself which makes the action right? Or does God command what is independently good? Is an action right because God commands it, or does God command it because the action is right? And both interpretations have difficulties. If I say that whatever God commands is right simply because it is commanded by God, it is not entirely clear how commanding something can in itself make it right. Okay? Certainly when I give a command, that doesn't mean that I am commanding you to do the morally right thing. Okay? Although I'm not God. The other interpretation, which says that the reason God commands us to do certain things, like the Ten Commandments, are because they are objectively right, independent of their being commanded. And certainly, this seems to be more consistent with the way we think, Because after all, there are certain things we know are wrong, but they aren't explicitly stated in the Ten Commandments, like torturing children. Okay? It doesn't say thou shalt not torture children, but we know that would be wrong, even so. Okay? I would like to say to you that I happen to think this is a false problem. Whether God commands something because it is right, or if it is right because God commands it, ultimately boil down to the same thing. Because if God exists and is the creator of everything, that would include the moral order. And so the rightness of some action would be right because it is consistent with God's plan for creation. So God would not be commanding something which exists independently of his goodness. He would simply be commanding something which he has created as good, a possibility for action. And, it's interesting to think about divine command theory, especially if you think about the biblical story of Abraham and Isaac, right? What does God command Abraham to do? Kill his son Isaac, right? So, and of course, because Abraham was willing to do this, even though God stopped him, right? He sent, I guess, the angel Gabriel to say, don't harm a hair on the child's head. Your willingness to be obedient has proven you worthy of having descendants that number as the stars in the sky, and so forth. Okay? But think about this. At the moment that God commanded Abraham to slay his son, before he recants that commandment, if divine command theory is correct, then at that moment it would have been the right thing to do. And then become wrong when God takes it back. Okay? So there are difficulties. The major one, of course, being the difficulty of proving that God actually exists. Which is why, or at least one of the reasons why, the favored tradition in a religiously oriented ethic is natural law theory. And this is largely the work of Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas was sainted, received sainthood from the Catholic Church, and as you may know, there are certain conditions for receiving sainthood, one of which is the authentication of something like 3 or 5 miracles. Okay? And one of the miracles which was attributed to the life of Thomas Aquinas was the sheer volume of work that he produced during the course of his lifetime. If you go to the library and look up Aquinas, you will be astonished at the amount of shelf space that it takes up. But our concern, of course, is to understand what natural law theory states. Okay? And one of its advantages is that it does not require us to believe in the existence of God. Aquinas argues that any rational being, and human beings are rational, have the same moral law available to them through reasoning alone. I do not need to believe first that God exists and that I am commanded to do certain things, or that the moral order of things is a function of the divine plan for creation. I can simply think about it and arrive at a correct understanding of moral goodness. So we want to see how this works. The first thing is to distinguish between three different types of law that Aquinas discusses. Okay? There is the eternal law. Now, what is this? Can anybody tell me, either from the reading in the textbook or from the lecture notes? What is the eternal law?
God's plan.
That's right. It is God's plan for creation, but as God himself understands it. Okay? So it would be a perfect understanding of the divine mind, which of course is the sole property of God himself. No matter how spiritually evolved a creature may become, at least on the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, one never becomes God. I am still other than God, and therefore will never have a divine understanding of God's plan. However, I can understand parts of it and participate in that eternal law. And a rational being's participation in the eternal law is what Aquinas calls natural law. And this is the basis for our ethical theory. Now, what do I mean by participating in the natural law? Or, excuse me, in the eternal law? Well, think about this. Simply by having a body, I am subject to the laws of physics, right? Even though nothing forces me to make the decision to jump up in the air, if I jump up in the air, my body comes down like any other body. Okay? I cannot violate the laws of space and time. And if the laws of space and time are part of the eternal plan set in motion at the moment of creation, then, of course, in my bodily existence, I participate in the eternal law because I am subject to the laws of nature. Right? Every event has a cause. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction, and so on. And my ability to articulate these laws of nature, like when I say an object in motion tends to stay in motion, or I should say as Isaac Newton stated, that also is a participation in the eternal law. Because what Newton is doing is observing the way things work and extracting the principle which governs the behavior of objects in space and time. So when we state some principle as a law of nature, we are saying that this is the way things have been ordained to operate by God. And this gives us a clue about what natural law theory is. Natural law ethics, like the other ethical traditions, of course, begins with an interpretation of the meaning of goodness. Okay, remember, For Aristotle, good meant virtuous, or producing happiness, understood as well-being and flourishing. For natural law theory, good means consistent with the natural purposes of things. Now, what does it mean to say that things have natural purposes?
It's in their nature to do what they're.
That's right. For example, what is the natural purpose of my eyes? To see. The purpose of my ears is to hear. The purpose of the bird's wing is to give flight. Okay? And when I ascribe a purpose to something, a natural purpose to something, I'm doing what we call teleology. And we've already seen a bit about teleological investigation when we looked at Aristotle. Aristotle originates the teleological model of knowledge. When I ask about the telos of something, I'm asking about its end or its final purpose, the reason ultimately for its existence. And so Aquinas would say that even though certainly there are many things I can do with a bird's wing, I can eat it, I can stuff it and hang it on the wall, okay? I could probably fan myself with it, or decorate the house with it, or pluck it and use the quills for writing. None of these things constitute its natural end. It would be irrational to say that the purpose of the wings of a bird is to make pens, because flight is a superior purpose. That is obviously the natural purpose of the thing. Yes, I can use my eyes for many purposes, to express myself, right? To wear mascara, right? But if I were to say that the reason God created eyes was for people to wear mascara, that would be ludicrous, okay? Obviously, the natural purpose of the eye is vision, its most perfect employment. Okay, you with me so far?
Can you trying to think of something else like cow, is that their natural purpose is their food?
Now it's
That's
a good question. But of course, that, I think, introduces the idea of divine law. Divine law, for Aquinas, means explicit guidance to living an ethical life that can be found in Scripture or in the sacred tradition of a religion. Okay? So, in other words, God gives us a little help. Even though we can reason our way to right action, we are given some guidance. But even then, I must use my faculty of reasoning to determine which scriptures and traditions are legitimate and which are not. Okay?
Which one you said was the interpretation of goodness? Is that the natural? It begins with
The natural law is the rational being's participation in or interpretation of the eternal law. Okay? Now, I might say that it is written that God gives dominion to humanity over all of the animals, and so that their existence is in the service of our existence. Okay? Now, I'm not going to say that with definitiveness. After all, there may be some things which I cannot discern with certainty their final good. Okay? But I think probably in the case of the cow, it would be to provide goods for people.
Yeah, back in the day, it'd be like clothes or whatever.
Sure, and still, food, clothing, labor. Okay?
Would that be a relative almost?
Well, that's the problem, right?
Someone-
Because
yeah, someone who's
it-
vegan wouldn't agree with that.
absolutely, I can't put myself in the calves of a cow, okay? The hoofs of a cow, the calves of a cow. I can't put myself in the cow's shoes, right, and know what the cow's experience of the world is like. And so I can't, with any kind of certainty, tell you that the cow doesn't have something like a rational experience of the world. Okay, and remember, that's how Aristotle defines human nature, as rational and social. Okay? Aquinas will agree with Aristotle that we are rational and social beings. But he adds two more fundamental aspects of human nature. Okay? And those are to procreate and simply to live.
Those are the two what?
Remember, Aristotle says that we are rational and social, okay? And our reason, of course, is the faculty of knowledge, right? It is my ability to know things. And my social aspect is what gives rise to sociability, making bonds of friendship and love with people, okay? Aquinas adds to knowledge and sociability two more aspects of human nature. That we are naturally given to the procreative act and also to the preservation of our own lives, as well as toward creating bonds of sociability and seeking knowledge. Okay? Now, in the same way that I can ask about the natural purpose of something, like an eye or an ear or a heart as a muscle that pumps blood, okay? I can also ask about the natural purpose of my inclinations. Now remember, when Aristotle said that virtue exists in order to translate feelings and emotions into right action, action that brings about happiness. That is very close to what Aquinas means by my inclinations. I am inclined to do certain things. Just like natural objects are inclined towards certain behaviors. The difference between a natural thing and a human being is that we are free to initiate actions on our own. But a rock is not. Okay? A rock can initiate nothing. It requires a force outside of itself to be set in motion. Whereas the principle that sets me in motion is my freedom. Okay? So I might say, for example, that a rock is inclined to roll downhill. Okay? It is subject to the laws of gravitation, as is my own body. And after all, we call this an incline, don't we? The side of a mountain or a hill or, a road that is graded. It's an incline. It inclines things to roll downward. And I am inclined toward many things. So just as I might say that the eye is naturally inclined toward vision, the ear is inclined toward hearing, I can ask, what is the natural purpose of my inclinations? And according to Aquinas, we have 4 basic inclinations. I have an inclination to preserve my own life. Right? When I am met with danger, I have a flight or fight response. Right? I can't, or it is very difficult to usurp the inclination to preserve your own life. Okay? Although it is possible, apparently, because people do commit suicide. Okay? I have a basic inclination toward procreation. We have a sexual instinct. Okay? Likewise, I have an instinct toward friendship, toward associations with people. We are gregarious. Okay? We aren't solitary animals. We're social animals, as Aristotle had already said. And finally, I have an inclination toward knowing things. As Aristotle said, human beings have a pure desire to know. And when he says it is a pure desire, he means that we desire knowledge for its own sake. It is not simply a practical desire to know. I want to understand things for the sake of understanding them, not because I necessarily need to understand them in order to do something. If I hear a loud noise outside the room, I want to go look at it. Right? This is why it took me twice my normal time to get to school today, because there was, an accident on the side of the road and people want to look at it. We are naturally inclined to know things. We wonder about things. And of course, remember that Aristotle said that this is the highest employment of my reason, when thinking is done for the sake of thinking and is not put in the service of practice alone. So my inclination toward wondering, toward questioning, figuring things out, is what he means by my inclination to know. So just as we were able to reason about the natural purpose of things like the eye and the ear and the wings of a bird, I can ask, what is the natural purpose of these 4 inclinations? Why do they ultimately exist? Well, clearly, my instinct to preserve my own life suggests that life itself is a fundamental good, like seeing or hearing, which are aspects of living. Okay? And so, given that I am inclined toward preserving my life, and even an attempt to end my own life is very difficult to see through because this inclination is so strong, it follows that life is a fundamental good, and it is the reason for my inclination to preserve it. And so I ought to, notice the ought, I ought to preserve and promote life rather than contradict it or destroy it. Okay? And when I do things that are destructive of life and health, then I am committing a moral wrong. I have a fundamental inclination toward the procreative act. And my reason tells me that although the procreative act is capable of being used for other purposes, simply the expression of love, or simply gratification, it would be irrational to say that the reason why I have a sexual instinct is pleasure and not procreation. You can't stack the good of pleasure up against the creation of a life. Okay? I'm not even going to argue that point. Likewise, I am inclined toward creating social bonds with people. And so, sociability or friendship is a fundamental good. And so if I were to do something which takes advantage of your instinct toward sociability, like pretend to be your friend so that I can use you for something, then I am contradicting that fundamental good of friendship. I am using your inclination toward being friends for something other than genuine friendship. And so that, again, is to divert the fundamental inclination from its proper purpose. And likewise, knowledge. If I seek knowledge in order to do something destructive of life, if I learn how to make bombs and kill people, then I am perverting the inclination toward knowing things. Knowledge is a fundamental good. And so when I deceive you, if I lie to you, I am contradicting knowledge because I am disseminating falsehood. Okay? If I break a promise to you, that violates the good of sociability. It makes you mistrustful of people. If I become a slave of my sexual instinct and seek sexual gratification outside or independent of being open to the possibility of life, then I have perverted that inclination from its proper purpose. Okay? Which is the kind of argument that you would hear, right? Like in a sermon, that is especially a Catholic sermon, that sexual activity must be in the service of procreation. And when it is taken out of that context, it is immoral. Okay? Now, I don't necessarily agree with that. Okay? And I don't think Aquinas would necessarily agree with it, because after all, sexuality is a natural way of expressing sociability. Okay? I think the difference would be being closed to the possibility of offspring. There's nothing wrong with people who are genuinely love one another to be sexual, as long as they are open to the possibility of its giving forth life. Okay? And I do agree with that. I don't think you should be having sex with somebody unless you're willing to have a baby with them. So that's how the story goes, okay? And notice, none of this required that you believe in the existence of God. We are simply using our reasoning ability and asking, what is the natural purpose of these inclinations? And just as I can look at natural things, nature, and ask about the purpose, let's say, of gravity, the purpose of the heart, the purpose of my organs, I can ask about the purpose of my inclinations. And so I ought to preserve and promote the four fundamental goods indicated by my inclinations, rather than contradict those goods or destroy them. Okay? So goodness here means consistent with the natural purposes of things. Okay? And so we arrive at really our first moral principle proper, the principle of natural law. Okay? And the principle of natural law simply states that one ought to seek the fundamental goods indicated by my basic inclinations. One ought to perform those actions that promote the goods specified by the natural inclinations of human beings. Okay? You understand what that means? Okay? I ought to seek the preservation of life, the promulgation of life, social bonds, and knowledge, because that is why my inclination toward these ends exists in the first place. Okay? Now, sometimes the principle of natural law fails to give us clear answers. Okay? For example, what if I need to lie to you in order to preserve your life? Okay? If you ask me who took your iPod, and I know that if I tell you, you are actually capable of killing the person, okay? Then perhaps I ought to think twice about immediately telling you. Maybe I ought to perhaps just attempt to retrieve it by myself for you. Maybe or maybe not. It's something I'd have to think about. which is why, in addition to the principle of natural law, there are three other principles to which we can make appeal in seeking right action. Okay? The first one is simply the golden rule. And we're going to see really that the golden rule turns out to be an aspect of all the moral traditions. After all, if virtue means that we treat people justly and we are temperate and courageous, obviously this will have a positive impact on the people around me. I would want you to be temperate and courageous and to treat me with justice. And so I ought to treat you that way. Okay? So we see in virtue ethics there's an aspect of the golden rule. And here as well. Just as I recognize in myself these four inclinations, I recognize them in you as well. And so certainly I ought to treat you the way I would want you to treat me. Okay? And so I suppose I'd have to ask myself, would I want you to tell me the truth or to lie to me? And of course, I would want you to tell me the truth. If I'm asking a question, of course. So maybe there's the answer. Okay? The principle of natural law was inconclusive on the dilemma of lying in order to preserve someone's life. But the golden rule, I think, clears things up a little bit. I'd want you to tell me the truth, so that's what I ought to do for you. Okay? But what if the golden rule doesn't even help us? Then we make appeal to what is called the Pauline Principle from the Apostle Paul. Which states, that's right, that one ought not to do something evil for the sake of something good. In other words, the end does not justify the means.
One ought not to do something evil for the sake of good.
That's right.
Is that like telling a white lie, maybe?
Yes. Mm-hmm. I know that lying is immoral because it contradicts the fundamental good of knowledge. However, I do not know that by telling you the truth about who took your iPod that you're necessarily going to go kill them. So I am not justified in telling you a lie, which is something bad, for the sake of a possible good. Even if I knew that committing this moral transgression would bring about some good, which I never actually know, because I can't predict the future, and any number of factors can intervene. I am still not justified in doing something evil in order to bring about something else that is good.
Well, I'm trying to think. Alright, the image that comes to my mind actually is like the Batman movie where the guys are on a boat and he's gonna blow up the city or whatever. Just pretend that somebody on that boat could tell him a lie and you wouldn't arrest him. Is that like because the first action is evil? Is your lie evil?
Very difficult, right? because the stakes are much higher. The principle of natural law isn't helping me here because I'm violating one of these goods either way.
Right.
Okay? The golden rule is a little bit fuzzy. Okay? Because while, of course, I would always want you to tell me the truth if I ask you a question, speaking sanely and in my right mind, I would also want you to stop me from blowing up a city. Okay? So I suppose when we apply the golden rule, we ought to ask, do I mean that I should treat people the way I would want to be treated when I am frenzied and out of my mind, or in my best thinking? All right. But if the Pauline Principle fails us, there is a final principle to which we can appeal. And this is the principle of double effect. And this simply states that if an action has two effects, a double effect, one good and one bad, I am permitted to take that action, provided that certain conditions are met. Okay? First, the act itself must be something good. Okay? Lying, stealing, things which obviously violate these goods cannot be called good actions. Okay? Secondly, you must intend the good outcome and not the bad outcome. Okay? For example, let's say that a woman is pregnant and she discovers that she has a tumor on the uterus. Okay? And that unless she removes this tumor, she's going to die. But if she removes the tumor, it will terminate the pregnancy. Okay? Now let's say that secretly she doesn't want to have this baby. And so she uses the fact that she has this tumor as an excuse for having the surgery, which she knows will terminate the pregnancy. But she's not intending necessarily to save her own life. Her primary concern is the termination of the pregnancy. She's intending the bad outcome and not the good one, even though it's the very same action. Okay? So our intentions matter. And finally, it must be a serious situation. Okay? If we're talking about something trivial, then an action with a double effect would not be permitted. Okay? But if it's something that involves one of the other goods, like life or procreation or knowledge, then it is a serious situation. Yeah.
There were three, right?
There are four fundamental goods. Are you talking about the conditions of applying the principle of double effect? Yes.
What was the first one?
The first one is that the act itself must be something good. Okay? So obviously, killing the innocent, lying, stealing, these things are bad in themselves because they violate these. All right? The second condition, you must intend the good outcome and not the bad. The third condition, it can't violate the Pauline Principle, which, by the way, seems already to be satisfied if the first condition is satisfied. Because if the act is itself something good, then you're not doing something evil for the sake of something good. You're doing something good.
Does this like keep in mind like the consequences of you doing a good action, like telling the truth? Like say, for instance, someone you knew of a married couple with 4 children, and the man leads a double life and has 2 other children,
Right.
Or not in the family. You're aware of this information, but you're aware of what it could do to the other party by revealing the truth. But your intention is good in doing that, but the response to it could be terrible.
Well, we have to go through the steps. So I know that the man is having an affair, but if I tell his wife, it's going to break up their home. The children are going to have to deal with the aftermath of a divorce. And I am supposed to do what promotes the fundamental goods indicated by my basic inclinations. Obviously, knowledge tells me that I ought to tell the truth, because by concealing something, I'm lying by omission. Okay? But at the same time, I'm putting the good of sociability in danger. So maybe that doesn't help me. Maybe I have to appeal to the golden rule. Well, obviously, I would want to be told. Okay? And even if I'm the man, even if I'm the cheater, I know that what I'm doing is wrong. And I could make a sort of Socratic argument. Socrates would argue that nobody intentionally would do themselves harm. And that if I saw and understood what I'm really doing to myself when I act immorally, then I would never do it. The problem is I don't see the full implications of what I'm doing or understand the damage I'm doing to myself.
Also, I haven't like really thought about the consequences.
Right. So I think the golden rule tells me I ought to reveal it, because even if I'm the man, if I'm thinking properly, I can't continue to live this double life. Okay? Obviously, telling the truth is something good. Okay, if we want to make appeal to the double effect principle, because this doesn't violate the Pauline principle. Okay?
I have a question. What about, say, his example, but it's not like an ongoing thing, say it happened once or twice, and...
Right, you'd have to make a judgment about that. You know it.
No, I'm saying, but nobody else knows but this guy.
Right.
And
if I judge that the guy is genuinely reformed,
yeah,
right, and that I would do more harm than good in terms of these goods, then perhaps I ought not to tell him.
right. What about if nobody else knows except for that guy? Would it be wrong? Would it be concealing and lying by omission if he has truly like realized what he's done and is remorseful about it?
I am lying by omission is tricky too, okay? Because unless you ask me a direct question, I don't know that I'm under an obligation to tell you everything I know.
Right. Yeah.
And that's why Aquinas puts these safety measures in place. That if the principle of natural law itself is not clear, we have these other principles to help us make a decision. Okay? Now, for example, the one the book gives us. Okay, the book asks us to imagine that you're a person that is in the habit of reading at bedtime. Okay, and obviously, reading is a good thing because it's in the service of knowledge. It's a primary way of knowledge acquisition. But the eye doctor tells me, because I've been getting headaches, so I went to see the eye doctor thinking that it could be, that I need my prescription upgraded or something. And the eye doctor actually tells me that I have a degenerative disease, and that if I continue to read at this pace by dim light, I'm going to lose my vision. Okay? Which would violate an aspect of life. Okay? So the principle of natural law doesn't help us. The golden rule, well, there's nobody else involved here. So it's not a matter of treating somebody the way I'd like to be treated. And reading is not a bad thing to do. So the act itself is not something bad. So here I think we've got perhaps a genuine case that requires us to apply the principle of double effect. Reading at bedtime has both effects. It is in the service of knowledge, but it is also contrary to my vision and therefore life. One good outcome, one bad outcome. Well, the first condition says the act itself has to be something good, and reading is obviously something good. The second one says that I must intend the good outcome and not the bad. Obviously, I don't intend to do damage to my vision. That's not the purpose that I read at night. Okay, so we're good there. Third, it can't violate the Pauline Principle. Well, I'm not doing anything evil for the sake of something good. Reading isn't evil. And it must be a serious situation. And it is serious, I think, not to be able to. I mean, if this is the time when I am capable of reading with good comprehension, it's a rather serious situation. And so, in this case, it seems that I am permitted to do it. But, in the real world, things aren't so cut and dry, right? I mean, come on, I could read at a different time of day. I could find a different way to put myself to sleep. Okay? So, bear in mind that ethical thinkers set up these moral dilemmas deliberately not to give us a way out, so that it forces the theory to deliver an answer. Okay? Like the lifeboat scenario. There are 10 of us here, the lifeboat only holds 9. Okay? What do? Do we throw somebody overboard? Are 9 lives worth more than 1 life? Well, not according to this theory. Okay? Let's even say that the person we're considering throwing overboard has fallen into a coma. Okay? So they're not going to object, but obviously they would if they could, and their family will. Okay? But obviously, if we apply the Pauline Principle, throwing somebody overboard is a bad thing to do. Okay? And again, in the real world, we could probably take turns swimming.
Lap up.
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, the boat will probably be sitting still. So, the ethicist will beef up the example a little bit and say, no, these are shark-infested waters. There's no swimming. Okay? But I would definitely be violating the Pauline Principle to throw someone overboard for the sake of the possible good, not even a definite good, of saving the rest of us. When I don't know that at any moment a rescue helicopter might pass overhead. Okay? Or we could take turns bailing. You know? But if I'm forced to give an answer, natural law theory would not allow me to throw a comatose person overboard, no matter how many lives it would save. Okay? All right. So those are the broad strokes of the theory. And I think certainly enough for you to be able to succeed on a quiz. So maybe we can wrap this discussion up by just asking about 4 aspects of ethics, again, which Mazzoni categorized for us. What is the origin of ethics, ultimately, according to natural law theory? Well, ultimately, it's God's plan. Okay? But one of the advantages of this theory is that we do not need to go there, because God has given us reason. Or even if we don't believe in God, we possess reason and are capable of asking, well, why does something exist? Okay? Human nature. What is human nature? You've got it right here. It is rational and social, procreative, and life-preserving. It is directed at the fundamental goods indicated by these inclinations. What about the question of relativism? I think that this theory can accommodate cultural relativism. Okay? After all, you know, the traditions that one culture has, the practices of what a friendship entails, may look very different from one to the next, but they are both in the service of friendship, sociability, right? Their manners of preserving life may look very different, but it's still the same fundamental good. So cultural relativism, but certainly not ethical relativism, because if there is one God, creator of everything, then there is one moral order. And even without going there, if rationality is the same in all human beings, if we would come up with the same answers when asked what is the ultimate purpose for the existence of something, then we would have a universal moral code. Okay? And the practical question is answered simply by saying that an action is right that is consistent with the natural law. Okay? Questions? Yes?
When you say preserve life, you're talking about the actual beating of the heart in life, not like a virtuous life or
Right.
You're saying the actual
Yes. Actually living. Right. Not necessarily living well. Okay? Which means that I even have an obligation to help preserve the life of someone I know to be evil. Okay? But I also would have an obligation specified by my social instinct to help them to become a better person. And to help them to seek the knowledge of what that means. Okay? Excellent. All right. So I'll post the quiz sometime over the next couple of days. Okay? Give you 48 hours from the time I post it, I guess.
Quiz 4.
Yeah. Quiz 4. And your reading assignment is in the textbook, and it is the contract theory of ethics. Don't worry about what it says on the calendar, because we're slightly behind.
Quiz 3.
Tonight, quiz 3 is due.
Okay.
Okay, tonight by 11:59. Quiz 4 is not even posted yet, but of course you'll get an announcement when it is. Okay?